Okay, so I thought this would be a lot of fun. I still think we might make it a little fun. But you didn't hold back on your questions, which is cool. If you're visiting with us, I just want to let you know this is kind of an awkward Sunday in the sense that I don't have like a normal message kind of part of the series kind of thing. What we've been doing is talking about questions and how important it is to keep our faith and our lives just in general invigorating and fresh and constantly searching for new life and new purpose and those sorts of things, and doing that through questions. And we've looked at Jesus, who almost always answers questions with a question. At a minimum, he tells an ambiguous story that you have to think about and go, what does he actually mean by that? And how do we live with this? And you know, who is my neighbor? These kinds of questions that they call you to. We looked even at the early church putting different books and different things side by side that almost force you to ask questions about the text and discover new, fresh things out of that. We even looked at the practice of Jewish midrash. And so Paul was very practiced as a Jew and writing and thinking. And one of those things is that they debate. They argue, they ask questions, they dig deeper, they think about, well, what does this really mean and stuff like that. And so I've been encouraging you to ask questions. And sure enough, you asked questions. You can still ask if you have a thought, if you have one you want to add. We're going to do this next week also. And I'm not so much going to give or provide an answer, but sometimes just my perspective, sometimes new questions, that sort of thing for us to think about, sometimes options to say, here, go and look at this. But this morning, here's what our list looks like. So we're going to take a few minutes to look at suffering. We've got, essentially, the question, is God in control of every little detail? We have, what is church? What is this really about? If we have time, we also have a question about hell. She's not here. I might hold off that for next week. And then lastly, we have the anti-people. How do we deal with people who are anti-immigration or sexist or racist or anti-Muslim or whatever it is? How do we address these people, and how do we address the issue as a broader topic? So you weren't messing around, and we're going to start with suffering, something nice and light. Because it's important. I actually pulled a few different questions together to do this, and I'll read. Let me see if I can find it here. I'll read one. Here we go. Oh, well, this is, What do you do with suffering? Okay, that wasn't that great. Big question. But also the other questions kind of in line with it is if God's in control, why am I suffering? If God is love, why is all of this happening? And that's a fairly modern kind of question to ask. And so when we talk about suffering, we have all of this new information. Typically we have global kinds of understanding about suffering today that is really difficult to get a hold of. And then we're in an age when we can fix a lot of stuff. We can fix a lot of diseases. We can fix very complex physical, medical problems. We can fix problems of hunger and physical needs for a certain percentage, anyway, of our population. And And then at the same time, we rush off when someone passes. We rush them off to another place. They're not part of things as we grieve. We do a lot of things to limit our visibility of suffering, I should say. We do a lot of things to sort of box that and set it aside so that we don't have to deal with it the same. And so we ask questions that are different. They look different than previous generations or eras of people. But this idea of suffering is absolutely critical to the text. Some of you know this about me, some of you less so, but I read the Bible through essentially a lens of suffering, a lens of oppression. And what I mean by that is I read the text, and everywhere you look, I feel like I can't get away from this. Everywhere you look, you see a story about somebody who is suffering, somebody who is marginalized, somebody who is oppressed or pushed to the edges in their society, in their family, in their community. So we look and we tell stories, biblically, we tell stories about these people. Somebody like David, who shouldn't have been lifted up in his family, but was more the bottom rung. Someone with little power, little authority, little expectations is lifted up. This is the quintessential story of our Hebrew text, or our Jewish scriptures, is the story of the Exodus. Genesis is sort of the preamble. I'm excited for our study. Shameless plug. I'm excited for our study to move into the Exodus, because this is the story of the Hebrew people, of the Jewish people. Our backstory, right, is the story of the Exodus. And the way it's put is God speaks to Moses and he says, I have heard the cries of my people. I have heard their suffering. And in the Hebrew language, heard requires an action. Once you hear something, you can't unhear it. There's no way around it. It is now actionable. I hear and I empathize, and I will take action to address it. And so from day one in the story, in our backstory, God is saying to his people, I hear your suffering. And as the story continues, God is continually caring and calling people up to care for those who are oppressed, those who are pushed down, those who are taken advantage of, those who are suffering, constantly suffering. So the laws, if you've read, who's read Leviticus? It's a lot of fun. A few? All right. Leviticus is terrible. Don't read Leviticus. First. Okay, how about we don't read Leviticus first? But here's the deal. Even in Leviticus, in this really harsh environment of community and culture, in this place where everything is laid out, if you do this, death is the penalty. If you do this, here is you also take this person in vengeance. It is insanely dark to read through Leviticus. And on top of that, with our modern perspective, an egalitarian culture and equality and all of those values that we hold dearly and we hold as Christian values even, Leviticus seems to miss a lot of that. But here's one thing that Leviticus doesn't miss. It doesn't miss the view of those who are suffering. So even in Leviticus, even in one of these really difficult texts to read, we have the theme of the Jubilee. The Jubilee is the year that everything is given back. So if you go into extreme poverty, you have a hard year, you sell your land to care for yourself. Maybe you sell your children to care for yourself, or you sell yourself into slavery to survive, to simply survive. The Jubilee year is when by law, all of that is restored and undone. So there's like a kill switch on suffering. It's built into their laws. If you look at a few other things, one of the other passages that I love is how you grow your crops. When you go and gather your crops, you leave the corners, by law, you leave the corners of your crops for those who are suffering so that they can be fed. Today we have social assistance. We let the government do that. We pay our taxes and then somebody else deals with it, right? But this was built into the heart and nature of how you go about your daily work to care for those who are suffering. One last piece on suffering before we move past that. One of the best New Testament stories to get a glimpse of suffering. We have suffering throughout, and it's a little bit difficult, but essentially, a friend of Jesus is dying, and they send word to Jesus and say, "Come quick and save my brother." And so he spends some more time in the community that he's in, teaching and caring for people, and then goes. A few more days. He waits a few days, and then he goes. And when he arrives, they come out to greet him, almost bitter, a little bit jaded. Because if Jesus had been here, she says to him, "If you had only been here, you could have saved him." And they are weeping, and they are in grief. They are grieving. And Jesus grieves with them. And the one line that we can all memorize, Jesus wept, the whole verse, Jesus wept, tells us about a God, Jesus is the image of God, tells us about a God who comes and grieves with you. One of our lenses, or one of the ways that we look at suffering, is we say, why doesn't God fix this? And the question to be asked is how is God with me to carry me through that? And every story that we have about suffering, human agency in suffering, it is a natural process. God shows up to grieve and mourn and to say, "I hear your suffering." And so our response to suffering should be pretty much the same in some way. We join others as they grieve. We suffer with them as they suffer. And then we stand up, as God has called over and over and over, to injustices and places where we can change and alleviate suffering. And so Jesus wept with her, and then he gets to do something that we don't get to do. He raised the guy from the dead, and ends that for the time being. But the point is, he is there with them grieving, with them in their suffering. And when possible, we step in also to alleviate suffering. You were probably looking for some solution to that age-old question. Interestingly, Job is probably our oldest text, our oldest book of the Bible. It's all about suffering. So the most ancient of our texts, of our Bible, is on suffering. All right, let's move on. See, this is fun, right? Am I having more fun than you? All right. Simple question. Does everything happen for a reason? I was driving in Atlanta. I had a friend in the car with me. I don't remember where we were headed or what we were doing. And I slammed on my brakes at a yellow light. And it turned red right after that. And I looked over, and as soon as that happened, the light turns green, and a police car is driving through. And I said, wow, that was close, because I almost just ran that light. And I would have gotten a ticket. And she looks at me and she says, well, everything happens for a reason. I said, well, I don't actually think that's true. And she goes, what? And then we had this big conversation about everything happening for a reason. Here are some of the things, okay? Everything happens for a reason is a really nice way to help us through suffering. So this leads us out of the suffering question. It's easy for us to add a sentence to a really hard moment and say, well, everything happens for a reason. Like we get to hit the reset button and move on, like that suffering isn't there, or like it means something more than that. And we devalue our suffering. We devalue that pain in the process of saying that. There's sort of two camps. What we're really asking is God in control of every detail? And there's two big camps here. There's the Calvinist side of things, and there's the Arminian side of things, and they clash somewhere in the middle. One side says that everything has been predestined. If you go sort of full Calvin, then everything is predetermined. Free will loses its place in that story. Your ability to make decisions about your life loses its place in that story. Your ability to make faith decisions loses its place in that story. In fact, what happens is God decides who is saved and who isn't. And that gets really dark, really fast, right? More fun. On the other side of things, we have the Arminian debate, which is essentially free will. And now they would also tell you that we're all broken and doomed and all of this other stuff, but we have agency, human agency, to make decisions and move forward and do good things. The problem where we run into issues is, doesn't God know everything? And guess what? There's a camp that says God doesn't know everything too, which is a lot of fun. But the problem is, if God knows everything, then how do I actually have a decision to make? And so you have these theological and philosophical kind of conversations about things. Here's what I want to offer as sort of a solution. Not really. If we have a specific plan for us and we have free will, then we most certainly ruin our specific plan, and we ruin everyone else's specific plan in the process, and on it goes until everyone in the whole world's plan is ruined and nobody can recover from it. That's not fun. But here's what I think is great about this, is that we get into a conversation about everything happening for a reason, and we get to talk about reinterpreting our life through Christ. And in the process, giving everything a reason. Let's try that again. So if we let go of everything happens for a reason, and then attribute meaning through Christ to everything that happens, we have a new reason for how things occur. All right, we can move on? No, not at all. I know better. Here's how that plays out. If Jesus is the center of our faith, if Jesus is the full representative of God, if Jesus is the image of God, if Jesus carries his life to the cross as that image, fully invested in the lives of people to sacrifice and be in that place in complete and total sacrificial love. If that's who God is, and if that's who Jesus is, then we get to interpret our life and everything that happens around us through that. It gives us hope in a moment of suffering. It gives us meaning in something that feels meaningless. It gives us life when something feels lifeless. So let's talk about, we could talk about something specific. We could talk about the loss of a job, or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of faith, or the loss of some specific piece of faith. We lose and reinterpret life all the time. And to look at things through the lens of Christ gives us an opportunity. So we look out at suffering and we see a world that is totally messed up. We see people killing over religion. We see people killing over sexuality. We see people pushed to the margin over their gender. We see suffering to the nth degree and oppression to no end, right? Through the lens of Jesus, we are able to insert God's sacrificial love into those moments. We are able to be that light and that love, and we are able to be that voice in that. And at the end of the day, we say, okay, that's being done in the name of religion, but let me tell you about a God who loves relentlessly, no matter where you've been, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. God loves you. And hope is restored, life is restored, and meaning is given to suffering even. Not because the suffering was supposed to do something, but because you've looked back at the suffering and put God into the storyline, and now suffering has a purpose and a meaning to your life. It doesn't happen right away. Sometimes it's long coming. Now we can move on. All right, so what about church? The question goes, what time are we at? We're doing okay, right? You need a coffee break? Okay. Does the institute of the church do more harm than good? And why are we so convinced that Sunday morning is an integral or central part of following Christ? So why are you here? I should have a good answer for this, right? Otherwise, you won't be back next week. So here's what's great about this. There's not a great reason for the church. We have turned the church into a building, and I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is we've turned the church into a structure, into even that question, the institute of church, puts church as something, as a thing in itself, as a thing alone that is apart from you inside the church, right? You can send a text with a little church emoji and say, I'm headed to church emoji, right? Church is a thing. It's a building, and there's a steeple, and there's a cross on it, and there's this and that. Different churches look different ways. But the reality is, it's not church. Church is the gathered people. And the more to be honest, the more I continue in my own personal process of faith, another church will tell you something totally different about the purpose of the building and everything. But the further I go along in the process of my own faith, the deeper I get into the aspect of community being central, not just to church, but central to what it means to follow Jesus. Jesus constantly drew people in and drew people together. We said at the communion table, and we do it every week because this is central to who we are, is that we gather around as one body, as a family. We put that in our website name, Open Door Family. We put that on our marketing materials because we are a family, and we want that to be central in how we think about what church is. So what happens in community? We've already talked about it. We suffer together. We sing praise together. We share our moments of joy together. We've had a baby join us. We've had 2 others that have joined us in the last couple of months we celebrate new life together. We celebrate the high points of faith, and we celebrate we don't celebrate, but we suffer together those dark and sort of depressing moments of faith together, right? That's community. That's what church is. And to be honest, the Sunday morning thing is a tradition. And I want to tell you, you don't need that. But then again, you won't be back next week. It's a convenient time. And it's helpful for us to know Sunday morning happens, and I know I can go somewhere and be part of a community. But again, as I've gone further and further along, community is where you see God's love happen. And I don't think that you can fully know and understand and experience God without community. Now, that doesn't have to be the peak and steeple church. We see God in faces everywhere we go. We see God in communities of all types, colors, and types of whatever. Everywhere we go, we can see God working. Community here, church here, happens with a purpose to worship, to be together, to discover faith, to love, to enjoy, and suffer through life together. That's church. So does it have to be about, how was the question put? Does it have to be about a Sunday morning thing? No. Does sometimes church do more harm than good? Absolutely. Absolutely, because when you tell people that you experience God in community, and then that person hurts you, you've now been personally hurt by God. That's why we have to work extra hard to love and to be that love. Historically, the church has done some horrible things. Like just terrible. Like most wars are church-related or have been church-related historically. That's not good, right? But we're working on that. And we're getting a new understanding of not the building, but you, the church. And me included. I'm included with that. What time? 45. All right. Okay, we're going to skip hell. How convenient. How convenient. We're going to skip hell and look at one more question. With regards to people being anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, anti-First Nations, etc., how can we respond when there is some truth in it? Some truth in what they're upset about, I think is the deal. So here's the deal. Jesus was quite radical. You probably already knew that. We like to spiritualize Jesus and have this like story about this guy that went around loving and teaching religious truths and stuff like that. But Jesus was actually radical in his love for people. His love actually offended people when he loved them. What's the greatest command? He says, love God, love your neighbor. Well, who's my neighbor? Well, actually, your enemy is your neighbor. Love your enemies. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And I'm telling you, love your enemies. Love your enemies and your neighbor. But this is a radical idea that actually offended people. I don't know how to say this nicely, but this is kind of where and this is my own personal perspective here. So you can keep your own and have your own opinions on immigration or, they should all be loving, but you could still have opinions on what we do with immigration. But my own opinion is, there are plenty of people that are actively stopping those who are suffering from getting the help they need. I don't need to be one of those. I don't need to put the lock on or whatever it is. My job is not to do the stopping. Sometimes I tell our board this. I say, my job is to push to get you to give more, and your job is to cut me off. Because it's not my job. It's not my job to tell who gets to come in and who doesn't, and who we have to keep out and all of that stuff. My job is to love them endlessly. Because that's what Jesus did. And that's what I'm supposed to do. Now, if I'm president or prime minister or any other head of state, I have to think differently about how I secure my borders. As it is, I don't have to. Homeless on our streets in Maple Ridge? Lots of people are hating the homeless in Maple Ridge. I don't need to be another voice like that. We need the alternative voice of love from God. So I always answer with love. That's my personal stance. Love them, let them in, do what they need, care for people that are in need. But Bradley, what about making sure we're safe people? Well, that's somebody else's job. It's not my job. My job is just to love people. And that's not all that practical, I'll be honest with you. Let's talk about some psychology here. It really, really makes us feel good to secure our borders. National borders, personal borders, church borders, religious borders. It really makes us feel good to be able to say who's in and who's out. There's a lot of research and work being done on tribes right now. And we mean this in a bunch of different ways. When we look at Israel's history, we talk about tribes, and they were a tribal community, and they were a family that cared for their own. They set up borders. They did what they needed to do. They talked poorly about others so that they could make sure to secure their own community, their own family, their own tribe. But as we continually learn more and more about the suffering of people around the globe, we continually expand our notion of tribe. I was listening to a theologian, actually in Vancouver, a few weeks ago, and she was talking about tribe, and she gets on this rant about slugs and sloths and people and trees being a part of our tribe. And the notion of neighbor has just been exploded as we understand our world and our communities and the people around us. We love to define our tribe. It's one of the things even that would make, say, a successful church, is to be able to say, we got to band together against the world. We've got to get our group centered on who we are and make sure that we're against this. And it gives us a sense of tribe. It gives us a sense of easily saying no to love. That's what it really does. It gives us a sense to easily say no to love. This is less related, but it's very interesting, and I've been thinking about it a lot. It's called moral licensing. I'll give you an example with Donald Trump. That's fun, right? Donald Trump has high-level executive women in his companies. I don't know where they are or who they are, but that's what he keeps telling us. I've hired lots of women. The women, they love me. This is what he says. Because, and moral licensing, this is a story about moral licensing, because he feels that he's done his job of hiring a woman, lots of women, I don't really know, but some women in his company, it gives him the moral license to cut off how he treats them going forward. He said, I've done my part. I'm not a sexist. I don't hate women. I love women. They love me. And so now I can talk very disgustingly about women to reporters and, in his campaign stuff and all kinds of stuff. There is something inside us. There's something inside us that once we've done one good thing, we feel that we can stop doing good things. Like, well, I've already done my part. I fed the homeless this week. So now I'm going to post a rant on Facebook. Or I posted a good thing on Facebook about the homeless. Now I don't need to go and actually care for them. This same thing happens when we talk about being anti-Muslim or racist or sexist or whatever. We say, I'm not racist. I've got a black friend. That's what we say. That's what we say. I've got a black friend. And so that gives us the right or the privilege, then we think, to do other things that in our actions are completely racist or are completely sexist. Or we say, I'm not anti-Muslim. Everyone should have their faith. I'm just talking about these Muslims, right? And so it gives us some sort of sense of freedom in what we're doing and what we're saying. So I don't know how to answer that question. How do you talk to somebody in that headspace? But I do know that my role is not to protect our borders. My role is simply to care and love for people. And I promise you, how many do we have here? Maybe 50? For the video, 175. I promise you that there are 175 voices out there that are providing the no, the anti, the sexist, the racist, whatever it is. You don't need to be that voice because it's already there. And when you speak that voice, you misrepresent God in the process, because Jesus radically loved everyone.